Hi, my name is McIntosh. I'm in DS Science. My project is Atmospheric Effects on Musical Instruments, investigating the impact of temperature and humidity on tuning stability. So, what inspired me to do this research is that I'm a musician. I've played for well over half my life both bass and piano, and so essentially what I was thinking was when you have a stringed wooden musical instrument like an acoustic bass, what will happen is, of course, if you just leave it anywhere in any environment over time, it will drift out of tune. That is to say that the strings will vibrate at a different frequency over time than what they were tuned to. Of course, this is bad, makes your playing sound bad, it's undesirable. And musicians, they love to argue about what causes this exactly. Some say it's the temperature change in a room, some say it's the humidity, some say it's, any other thing. So I decided to quantify that with my research so you can really say definitively what affects how a musical instrument changes its tune and how. So the two factors that I picked are temperature and humidity. Those are, I think, the two big ones that people talk about. They're talking about that. And in my review of literature, that's what I found too, is that temperature and humidity is likely to cause a change on the wood that comprises these wooden instruments, and that should in turn cause the tuning of the strings to change just based on the mechanical properties of wood changing, which I'll get into a little bit later. So the research question, essentially is that just how does temperature affect the changing in tune of a wooden stringed musical instrument over time, and how does humidity affect that? So essentially what I did was, as for scientific purposes, I had to create my own standardized instruments, and what I have with me here is a prototype for one such instrument. I ended up using one's a little bit different in the final answer. I didn't use this one; it's a bit rotten on the back. But so what these are is just a simple plank of wood, and on one end I have these bolts, nuts, washers. They are holding on just regular guitar strings, and they are secured, fixed at the other end. And what I can do with these is by twisting these nuts here, I can change the intonation of the strings when they are plucked or struck. And so all that means is that, when I don't know if you can hear that, but it is indeed vibrating and producing a sound like a guitar would. And so what I did was I tuned these instruments up to the same vibrating frequencies. And for my control trials, just to set a standard of how far they drift out of tune with nothing extra is affecting them, I just placed them on the research environment in my basement, and I allowed them to sit for a period of 6 hours, during which every hour I would come back, and by plucking every string and measuring its intonation with a phone app designed to tune instruments, I would find how their intonation changed over time. And on my poster here, you can see the control trial right up here, so you can see that they all drifted out of tune to the what musicians call flat. That means the intonation decreased over time. And so then for the trials measuring temperature, what I did was I placed them in a greenhouse that I had made, pictured here, and I placed a space heater inside, turned it on, waited for the temperature to just about level out, and I would place these instruments inside. And then the same procedure, I would wait for 6 hours. Each hour I would return. I would pluck all of their strings, measure their intonations, and plot it on a graph shown here. I'm not sure how obvious that is to the camera, but we did see a decrease or an increase in the rate that they went out of tune. So that is to say, over time, these strings became more and more out of tune and at a rate faster than control. So there's a significant change when the temperature is increased. And then with humidity, what I did was I had a few humidifiers, which you can see one or two of them here. And these humidifiers, same thing, I placed them in there, I turned them on, I waited for the relative humidity to reach 100%, which I measured with a digital hygrometer, and then I placed the instruments inside, all tuned up. Once every 6 hours I would return, pluck their strings, measure their change, and this showed some very significant results. We know the way that you can see. That being that the instruments not only went out of tune faster, but they went the opposite direction. So their frequency that they vibrated at increased over time. So essentially the way that the atmospheric conditions affected exactly. So as far as temperature goes, So, like I was talking about, instruments that are made of wood, and wood is able to take on and release moisture. And what this does, as I've learned in my review of literature, is that this will change the mechanical properties of wood. So, when you increase the temperature, not only does it do that, but it will also affect these strings, and that they will expand. So, anything essentially that heats up expands, few exceptions, but especially metals will. These strings are made of metal. And so what will happen when the temperature is increased, that we will see a little bit of an expansion in the strings, which would stand to reason that that would cause the instruments to drift more out of tune to the lower side, such that the tension would decrease when they expand. And as far as the wood goes, so this kind of gets into one of the larger research, the problems that I faced in controlling my experiment, and that's the relative humidity of air is not just based on the water content, and as the name relative would suggest, but is also based on the ability of the air to take on water. So at a lower temperature, air is able to take on less water, which is why the air in the winter is drier, because it doesn't have the capacity for water that warmer air does. So what happened when the temperature increased in there is that the relative humidity would have decreased, not as a product of adding or subtracting any water from the air, but just by changing the temperature of it. And so the moisture that likely was already present in the wood would have left it. And what this would naturally cause from something leaving the wood is that the wood would contract, which would also lead to what we've seen with the decrease in tuning frequency, because the wood would have contracted, the tension would have decreased. And then the opposite would have happened when the humidity increased, is that the relative humidity, of course, was directly affected, changed to 100%, and this would cause the wood to take on a lot more water, and when wood takes on water, it expands, naturally. So when the instrument expands, it goes out like this, and the strings are pulled on tighter by the wood, which would cause the strings to be under more tension, which would make them vibrate at a higher frequency. So that's essentially the rationale behind what's happening and how exactly the atmosphere affects the instruments. So as far as the implications of this research go, what this allows musicians to understand is how exactly the environment will affect their instrument. So let's say there's about to be rain coming in the weekend and the humidity is going to increase. They know generally how that's going to affect their instrument, and might even allow a musician to alter their instrument such that it is not so severely affected. So let's say that, with this research, we know that humidity will cause the instrument to drift out of tune in the higher direction for its strings to increase in frequency over time. So the musician might say before rainstorm, before their room gets more humid where their instruments are stored, they could even tune their instruments down such that it cancels out and has a less of a net effect on the instrument. And that is also significant in that significant changes in tuning might damage the instrument, or especially the strings. It's not just a minor effect that can be alleviated with tuning pegs, though often it is. Say if an instrument is left over time in like an attic or something, and it undergoes frequent cycles of change in temperature and humidity, that might cause strings to snap, that might cause the wood in it to warp. And this also allows those who preserve instruments, say if a museum gets a donation of an old instrument that hasn't been properly stored, they can analyze that to determine how that instrument has been stored, what environmental conditions it's been affected to. Say they know that the strings have drifted significantly out of tune one way or another. Well, they'd be able to know exactly what process that went through and how to reverse that. So yeah, that was the significant impact there. So as far as future research goes, there is definitely something to be said for the permanent effects on instruments in regards to atmospheric change. So, when an instrument has gone through many cycles of changing its tune, the wood might become warped. I don't know if you'll be able to see on camera, but the wood that these instruments are made of has indeed warped over time. I don't know if that's really showing up. There's a little bit. The wood has warped from these instruments. Of course, they're not made out of instrument quality wood that you'd see in a professional instrument, but regardless, just from the tension of the strings and the experiments I've performed on them, they have changed. And so research could certainly go more in depth on how exactly that affects an instrument in a permanent way rather than just a temporary, retune it again type of way. And more research could also do more atmospheric effects. Of course, temperature and humidity are not the only conditions an instrument can be placed into. And certainly more research that is able to carefully control relative humidity for the temperature trials. We could see exactly just how temperature increase affects it, rather than a temperature and kind of relative humidity as well. So that's what kind of would lie on the horizon of more research in this avenue. So as far as my project has helped me understand more and grow as a person, I'd say that doing this research really helped me understand the exact discipline that goes into research of this magnitude, which is something I foresee more of in the future in college. And it's also really helped me understand about presenting ideas that I've come up with, that I've performed research on, and not just understanding from that research what the implications are, but allowing others to understand, and presenting that in a meaningful way. So that's all I have for my project. Thank you for your time. Goodbye.